My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowski Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. Zohran Mamdani is approaching his 100th day as mayor of the nation's largest and most important cities, and so far as I can tell, we have not become the socialist paradise many hoped for and others feared. The rich have not fled, and the buses are still not free, though 3 months is hardly enough to overhaul this city. But it is enough time to assess how he has approached his job, to what degree the social, political, and budgetary realities have tempered some of his campaign promises, and what we should expect as he wrestles with Albany and the city council, as he tries to build on his vision in the face of the legal mandate to balance the city's budget. We're joined by 4 New Yorkers with varying approaches to assessing Mamdani's first 3 months in office. Leanna Zagari writes the weekly Bigger Apple newsletter on city affairs for the Manhattan Institute. Ruth Messenger was the Manhattan Borough president and one-time mayoral candidate, who, by the way, I covered when I was a reporter at New York Newsday. Jaime Estadas is in the School of Social Work at Columbia University and founded the Latino Leadership Institute at Hunter College. And James Rodriguez is a professor at CUNY's School of Labor and Urban Studies focused on housing. Ruth, let me start with you.
Okay.
You actually were a member of Democratic Socialists of America, an earlier version of it. And to what degree is he tempering his ideology? I mean, is reality changing what he's doing? I mean, assess how he's doing.
You know, a term is 4 years, so you want to see what's happening right off the bat. But 100 days is a tiny little amount of time, first of all, and second of all, in this city. This is a complicated city with a huge, huge budget, very large number of people. And so anything is going to take more time. So the only thing I would say is I'm not quite sure that he understood how hard it was going to be to move each of these levers and figure out what to do. But you know, people learn on the job.
He is 34.
Well, not only that, but look, I mean, I can't remember how old I was, young, but not maybe quite that young, but when I first took elected office, but you have a profession, I'm a social worker, you think you know what you're doing, and then you get in the middle of government and you figure out all of the ways in which it works. Very often in a good, populist, democratic way, and very often in a behind the scenes, all kinds of craziness way, and you have to learn that. And the one big thing that I think appears to me to have been a challenge for him, is you have to be able to appoint 7 zillion people, not that many really, but large numbers of people. You can't only appoint the people you know well. You have to find out who are the experts in some of these fields and what positions should they hold. I mean, the good news and the bad news is it's not like it's a lockstep chart and you just punch a bunch of people in. One thing that I would just say, we can come back to this later, but I don't yet see something that I always believed when I was in government, and that is, in any agency, ask the people 3 steps down. They can tell you more than anybody else about what works, what doesn't work, where the levers are, and I don't yet see that happening in most of the agencies where I have some direct connection.
I will tell you, when I was a reporter at City Hall, those are the people you wanted to talk to. It was the people, not the commissioners, but the people a couple of levels down. Leanna, this idea of reality, this idea of a $5 billion plus deficit that has to be covered. And deficits are fungible. They're not, this is not, these are not hard and fast numbers that have to be met. But, in some of the writing that you've been doing is about, I get a sense that the business sector is not as horrified as they thought they might be, but they're not very happy.
That is correct. I mean, Mamdani inherited a pretty big mess when it comes to the budget that he has to fill. And, not that many ways to fill it. He wants to raise the taxes and one way or another. And then the reality is
one way or another means personal income taxes, which needs the
correct.
State, or property tax, which is the third rail of New York City politics.
And if you want to be reelected, I think the third rail is pretty hot. So, I mean, he's been trying to be pragmatic, which is a nice thing to see in appointing those savings officers to each department. it will be interesting to see how exactly they've come up with the 1.7 billion in savings, given that what's been out there is not all that much.
That's
And,
1.7 in 1.7 billion savings from the current budget that he
current
wants
budget.
as a major down payment towards filling
for this year and
budget
for the
gap.
next
Right.
year. So
Right.
that's correct. You know, the city is doing all right. I mean, in terms of the bonuses, the Wall Street's doing all right. There's money coming in, but there isn't money coming in on the regular basis. So he needs to fund the programs that he wants to do from recurring revenues. And that is where his biggest challenge is. Spending is faster than the revenue.
I mean, one of the, talking about people who have been appointed, this is, politics is about a lot of things, including identity. And there's been significant complaining, particularly within communities of color, non-Asian communities of color, but Black community, Latino community, about the lack of diversity at the higher levels. Does that interfere with his ability to govern?
Yes, and I think, and I'm going to piggyback from what Ruth said at the beginning. Those are the people who have been working also at mid-level in government.
Who know where the bodies are buried.
Who know where the bodies are buried. And
have some bright ideas.
and yes, wherever I go, if I get a new job, whatever, I usually do that. I know what the executive director is going to tell me. I know what the vice president is going to tell me. Because everything is peachy. Mm-hmm. And everything is going to be okay. And we're going to the future. Then you talk to the clerks and everything is said, this is, this is going on. I mean, can we curse here?
Angelo Falcone is the one, the late Angelo Falcone is the one who cursed on the show before. So you're in very good company.
And those are the people that you talk to. So when you eliminate the real intelligentsia of the institution, those who knows where everything is and how the history of how we got to where we are now and what were the mistakes, people are going to be very honest. Those are the most honest people in the institution. Usually those who are in charge, they are in charge of basically making sure that the press release is correct.
And the mayor looks good.
And the mayor looks good. So that's, you cannot eliminate that. That's the heart of the institution. But also in terms of what you were talking about before, this issue of socialism, this city has been one of the most socialist cities forever. It's full of socialism. You have Health and Hospital Corporation, which I used to work for. Mm-hmm. Nothing more socialist than that. You have NYCHA.
Where I grew up.
You have public housing. There is a lot of socialism that is extremely important, and now I'm going to talk from my Marxist years. You need that capitalism needs socialism in order to survive. Because if those safety nets were not there, capitalism will swallow everybody else. So you need these safety nets in the middle and that intelligentsia that says, if we don't have these services, we don't have these things here, capitalism is going to be a jungle.
That's the social democratic as opposed to socialist governmental model. And let me, James, this is going to be a master segue on my part, by the way. I want to tell you this in advance. The idea that these kinds of, public housing in particular is if you look at the class basis of socialism, if you will, you now have, Zohran Mamdani was elected largely drew very strong support from gentrifying largely white communities across a broad swath of northern Brooklyn and western Queens, who, for instance, would not benefit from a freeze of rent-stabilized housing because they do not live in rent-stabilized housing. And housing is where the rubber meets the road. That's, my kids, it's all, the hardest part is going to be able to afford a roof over their head. How has he approached it? Is he Well, just how has he approached it?
It's a good question, Bob. It's maybe the billion or the $1 trillion question when it comes to New York City, City Hall, and real estate. And I think thus far, and to Ruth's point, we are still very early days in this administration. But I think it's a pretty mixed record. I think that we're seeing some real advancements of City Hall taking seriously the needs of tenants in a way that we haven't seen from previous administrations. But I think, to your point, Bob, we're seeing a really different look at how this administration is looking at public housing, which in a lot of ways is a signal for who's being included in this vision of affordability that was such a central pillar of this campaign. And I think when we look at this administration's position towards public housing, its real embrace over privatization in ways that are really the antithesis to a more socialist vision or even a socialist history that we've had in this city, I think it raises really serious questions about how this housing vision is going to be implemented going forward, for sure.
Bob, I want to
Yes,
push
please.
back on one thing you said when you were talking to James. You said, like, this class of people who voted for him, well, they're not in rent-stabilized housing, so it doesn't matter to them. That's the big error.
Okay.
The people that the Manhattan Institute speaks to most closely, if they're well schooled, literally, by you, they benefit tremendously from, fill in the blank, the quality of the schools, the cost of housing for ordinary people, what it takes to have a workforce that can get to work on time. So that's where I believe that that's something he understands. It doesn't produce a new tax or a new housing immediately, but we are, in fact, in this city all connected. And you know, who you take your kid, okay, take childcare. Just let's take childcare, where they're moving forward, where the governor was smart enough, I want to say, to realize it's a huge bonus for her. There are other places in the state that need this. Moving forward, what is that going to mean? It's not going to mean just create some new centers or tell people they can register. It's like, what does that look like? To go back to Jaime's professional work, we need the largest number of teachers and social workers who are bilingual. That's who the population of this city is. We haven't had, with all due respect, a mayor or a governor that thought about, like, how are we going to get this workforce? How are we going to house this workforce? How is this going to work together? These are big questions. And I think at least I'm seeing somebody and some appointees who understand the interconnections and the complexities here.
My worry here is a little bit about the labor market, which has been stagnant in the city and growing really in the low wage sector, which really would not be able to afford market housing. Where it comes to Mayor Mamdani, I worry a bit about the focus on redistribution without growing the pie, which would help everybody. I mean, we need more money to provide for the services that the city wants. Childcare is a great example. Childcare is necessary. Whether the city is the best way to provide childcare remains to be seen. The demand for the childcare seats has not been keeping up with the supply as it is. We'll see what the new numbers are when they come out for how many people signed up. But you know, yes, it's needed, but it's needed in a format that actually serves the people who need it. And at the low end, they need a lot of flexibility. I mean, kids get sick. You work shift work. There's a lot of nuance in.
Let's stick with the housing just for a second. I mean, there are two immediate flashpoints right now. One is the Elizabeth Street Garden on, I think it's kind of the Lower East Side, which has been a beloved community garden that was supposed to be closed up and affordable housing built on it. It was held up. Now he wants to move ahead with the affordable housing, and the community, which are, you know, these are not terrible people. They believe in their garden. So there's that fight. Then there's a much more telling fight, if you'll pardon my saying, in Fulton Houses in Chelsea, where they want to essentially tear down buildings, including a building where senior citizens live, in order to build taller buildings, part of a privatization. Some of those new buildings will include market rate housing and replacement affordable housing, and they'll move people in. But some of the senior citizens who live there saying, I'm 80 years old. You want to move me out and then move me back in? Maybe I'm not that flexible. I mean, the rubber is meeting the road in those particular fights, and they're symbolic of the larger fight.
I think so. I think they're symbolic of the larger fight in so many ways. I think what's happening in the Fulton and Elliott Chelsea houses is sort of the forefront of the larger public housing question for sure. And I think we can zoom back out and also think about how public housing is a sort of litmus test for how we approach housing in general. And I really agree with the point that Ruth made earlier around rent stabilization. I think sometimes we fall into a trap of thinking around public versus private. There's ways that those get siloed, but even if you're not a public housing resident, the fate and the future of public housing and true and deeply affordable rental housing in this city is something that reverberates for every tenant and every renter in this city. And I think when you look at what's happening at the Fulton and the Elliott Chelsea houses, we've also seen this is a long-running campaign. This is a fight that actually goes back to 2019 and the de Blasio administration. So this is another way to raise how we think about City Hall's view of their own agenda when in at least these instances, we're seeing a retreat or in fact a continuation of policies that happened under Mayor Adams.
When you say we're seeing a retreat, where is the retreat? What is the retreat?
A retreat in terms of the return of these similar policies. In terms of Chelsea and Elliott, for example, that plan was a de Blasio era plan that started as a demolition plan that tenants really vocally opposed. And it was a contentious fight through the Adams administration, and now the City Hall is really continuing that legacy. And we're seeing that with the budget and the way they put that money into privatization as well.
Well, the great philosopher George Foreman said that you have a plan until you get hit in the nose.
Mike Tyson.
Mike Tyson, hit in the mouth.
Mike Tyson.
Brownsville,
I
Brooklyn.
love George Foreman.
Didn't Mike Tyson hit George Foreman?
Oh, maybe.
Well, and that's what is happening. You have, and this happens with any person that gets elected to office, whether it's left, whether it's right, or whether it's center. Everybody comes with a plan. Everybody comes with an idea of how things are going to take place. And then once you are in office, then the practice is not the dream. The practice is different because you are going to find out all these different obstacles and
It's
issues.
the Mario Cuomo point.
It's the you have.
Just so you know, you campaign in poetry.
Yeah.
You govern in prose.
And you have to learn as you go along. There are things that are just like that, and I think that that's where Mamdani is at this point. That there are things that he basically thought that could be done, and now it's not as easy as he thought. That how he can implement those things.
But I see his strength. I don't see it in active display yet, but I believe that his strength, which we saw a little bit in the campaign, is essentially to end up owning that.
Yeah.
And come back and say, okay, I said this, now here's what I've learned. But we can get to here, but it's going to take 3 steps. I mean, I'll give you an example. When I was in government, which is about dinosaur time, we fought very hard, as you will recall, for the Parks Department budget
1%.
to be, no. When I was in government, it was 0.7%.
Oh, is that right?
And we couldn't get there. And that's absurd. Now, for many years now, it's been 1%, which seems so obvious and so logical if you think about what any peoples need, much less a city of 9 million. So I gather from my colleague, Councilmember Gail Brewer, that in the budget hearings this week, the mayor said, this is exactly the kind of thing that I'm looking for, that's like the pros. The mayor said, I pledge that we will get to 1% in 4 years. Now, from my point of view, that's ridiculous because I think the Parks budget should be 5, some other number. But that's a pragmatic thing, and he's put himself on the line with the city council. We'll do this year, but then you have to figure out what the steps are. Everything we're talking about, how childcare plays out, what happens to public housing. I mean, you're right about those seniors. It's like telling people at 80, we're going to move you out for 2 years. But if there was a track record, and if he can build a track record of, I only say things that I know can actually be done.
Right.
Well, he was very good at promising things that depended on other people giving him money.
Right.
And so far, he's been very good at getting some of that money. I mean,
But let me say,
I agree with you.
But I want to build on precisely that point because that's where taxes come in, where he has been pushing the governor to raise the top level to allow the city to add a surcharge on, to raise the taxes on the highest income New York city residents. The governor has been pretty steadfast saying no. And his comeback, is it a threat? I don't know how you want to phrase it, is, well, maybe I should either raise property taxes or rejigger this very strange property tax formula that we have of 4 different classes of property, in which rental property is taxed disproportionately higher than single-family homes, than condos and co-ops, and so I mean we have this. I mean that undercuts the ability of a lot of rental housing development just by that property tax structure.
Attempting to fix both of them, I think, is I don't know, mission impossible in this city.
Well, it's always impossible until you try. So I mean.
That is true, but there's a lot to be said about the outer borough residents, and including immigrant communities that have built wealth in their property.
Built equity.
Equity, yes. There is also, that housing provides a lot of immigrant families with the ability to migrate.
Just one small point. I remember when I was a reporter, which was also back in the dark ages, that the house on the Queens side of the Queens-Nassau line could be of the same value as the house on the Nassau line, but pay a third of the property tax that was being paid in Nassau. Now, that homeowner in Queens was paying income tax, was paying all higher sales tax, but the lower property tax on private homes is one of the things that made it affordable for that immigrant. I mean, this is complicated stuff.
We can go in the weeds.
No, but it's the weeds, but it's real world. But implications.
That's why we don't need to go in the weeds here. What I think we're all saying is pick any one of these issues, and part of the problem is you have about 8 major city issues if you're the mayor. But pick one of these issues and really think it through. I mean, I think they might be doing this, but think it through. I mean, take the most recent tabloid hysteria that people died when it got cold around the street. Well, every single person in New York knows that. I mean, the mayor might not have known that and might have hoped it would be avoided, but if you've been here for a long time, you actually know if it's going to get that cold, some people are going to die. So then you get hit by the press. But then the question is, who sat down? I mean, I'm hoping this happened, and said, okay, this is a long haul problem. What is it that we need? Where do we need it? If we're going to have people who are going out to talk to people, homeless people, I mean, one of my friends, just a simple issue, one of my friends who works in housing in the not-for-profit sector said, just step one, if every social worker and every police officer had access to an app, which we all live in the world of apps, had access to an app in which you could say to that person wrapped in a blanket on your corner, we only have to walk 3 blocks and there'll be a shelter. Now, they wouldn't all suddenly jump up and come, but the people who are right now saying, oh my God, you're going to take me where I last was, someplace in the other end of Queens, where was terror. No, simple app that would just say, where is the closest shelter with a bed? So that's there's 1,000 things like that we need people to start looking at, to use technology. I have a friend who's done an analysis, just as another example. I have shared this with the City Hall. We'll see if they pick up on it. That says one of the biggest problems with SNAP, the food program,
food stamps,
in which people are dependent on, obviously getting cut off is terrible in terms of lack of access to food. But the person showed me an analysis that said most of the problem is that people don't do something that they have to do to keep their benefits. So they get cut off, so then they have to go to a center, and it's like the churning of people off and on, but an app would solve that. Right? Yeah. If you had a phone, everybody has a phone. I've discovered working with the immigrant community that everybody has a phone. If the phone said 2 days to do X to maintain your SNAP, I'm not saying every human being would do it. I'm saying it would change. So they need thinking about like that, and they don't need, and we're all agreeing on this, you can't promise everything's going to be different tomorrow.
And following the creativity that you need in order to come up with, to be a good manager, a good mayor.
Almost was the mayor, but that's
$4 billion that basically are needed for homeless people in the city of New York. He doesn't know where to get it. Now, he has a good relationship with the President of the United States.
Yes, he does. One of the strangest political bromances we have ever
The bromance is there, who recently cut $140 billion for programs for undocumented, for
Yes.
immigrants.
seen. Yes.
Don't you think that if you have that relationship, a phone call to...
How long have you been in this country? I know.
No. Well, look, I even know, I made Trump once run. I can tell you the story from me. That was a long time ago at City Hall.
Right.
When he was trying to get the towers in front of the United Nations. And all
Right.
that.
Right.
But anyway, I'm not going to get into that. Well, you know, there is $140 billion that the president saved. Can he give you $4 billion to deal with this cut that is happening here in the city based on that supposed great relationship that exists? That relationship has to be tested.
Well, let's.
I'll just say quickly to Jaime's point, and I think it really does bear something to consider because, again, going back to the public housing question, we've seen the narrative be that there isn't any money for public housing because of federal disinvestment.
Exactly.
And while that's been true, if we do have an open channel to the federal government in a different way, that is something that can and should be on the table if that's what's been identified as the issue. And instead, we've seen a plan potentially to build new, yes, affordable, but also market rate units in Queens through this new, not actually so new, Sunnyside Yards plan, right? And so I think these are ways that we can, yes, see that there are approaches to address the housing issue, but there are also ways that are really following older models that don't feel necessarily part of this newer campaign that brought us to this administration.
Talk about older models. I grew up from the time I was 8 in Linden houses in East New York. It's NYCHA, we used to call the projects, but now they tell me you're supposed to call them developments. But I am proud to be from the projects.
Me too.
I don't know why I have to call them developments. And when I became a reporter and covering Brooklyn and Newsday, it was in 1987, and I decided to look back at 1950. It was 30 years, and I looked back at the history. And in the 1950s, with federal support, federal commitment to supporting housing, we opened 15,000 NYCHA units per year, just NYCHA units. And by the time you get to the, early to mid 80s under Reagan, you're literally down to 500 units a year. So that commitment that you guys are talking about to federal housing support, I'd support it. I don't see it happening. I mean, you need to, one thing that Mamdani has done is he's realized that the private sector has something to do with housing.
I mean, in this city, yes, and you need the private sector to build housing.
He now realizes that.
We'll see how the numbers pencil out with the rules and regulations that are imposed.
Yeah, but the idea of relying on federal support, which obviously I would agree with you, in terms of supporting it, it's not very likely.
No.
I would agree with that, Bob, and I think also, and interesting enough, you look at some of the campaign rhetoric, Mamdani has at least spoken about this in his own terms as a candidate. There is still a sizable city and state responsibility to housing and ability for the housing to fund and in fact produce public housing. And in fact, it has produced public housing that is and was city and state funded alongside the federal funded housing that created the majority of the public housing program. So I agree that clearly the winds are not foretelling a massive influx of federal funds. I also think that it is not an entirely accurate or full picture to think that that's the only way for us to address public housing, especially when there are folks that are in dire need of repairs and really hundreds of thousands of folks that are within these communities that need that. So I think just throwing our hands up and saying the federal government isn't going to come in on a white horse, so then that must mean we must give over our public assets to the private sector, I think is a different reach to that conclusion.
And another issue, which you know I worked on for 20 years in government, is what we negotiate with the private sector to get them to build more housing.
Inclusionary housing.
You can say, like, we're just going to sit here and wait and see when the richest people in New York decide to build housing that's affordable. Not going to happen. So what are the negotiations? And one of the areas of negotiation is tax forgiveness. In my lifetime in city government, there were lots of tax forgiveness programs in which, with all due respect, the city never did any basic arithmetic. So the development community would announce, and it's their right. Like, if you want us to build that and make this much of it affordable, then no taxes for 10 years, or this or that, whatever they asked for. But the city acted as if they were captive to those arguments instead of saying, we've done some of our own analysis. We will do a tax forgiveness, but this will be the deal. You know, then people will say, oh, you shouldn't do a tax forgiveness. But I'm just saying, there's a way to do it smart.
I mean, in the end, the buildings also need to be sustainable, and that
Yes.
goes, I think, for private and public. You know, if a building doesn't bring in the revenue to cover its expenses, you're going to have disinvestment, and
Absolutely.
you're going to have the repairs that don't get done. And we have a lot of buildings that are affordable housing that are in distress.
Right, and then the question is, what do we do about it? All I'm saying is, it's a bargain, and I mean, a bargain and a negotiation.
True.
That's what I mean. And I always found that in many ways the private sector was eager to negotiate because they would get something from it, but the city would not hold its own in the negotiation, would say, well, wait a minute, that would be worth that. There's ways for him to do this, and I'm, again, hoping that as he begins to understand, okay, you need the private sector to build housing.
You know,
what are the deals?
We could talk about housing forever. I want to switch to a couple of other topics.
Good.
One is labor negotiations. You know, the city has factored into its budget, if you will, I think a 1.25% increase in its labor costs, which has never happened. I mean, it's always been double that or more than double that, and that exacerbates the longer-term problem of a budget gap that the city is trying to deal with now. Is that
That is a very correct reading. And, you know, he has to finish the budget before the negotiations start. So that's, you know, it's important that he's factored a fraction of what he is likely going to
But he's
need.
factored into it an unrealistic, it's any mayor. I don't mean to,
Yeah.
this is not to pick on Mamdani, but mayors factor into their budget lower anticipated labor costs, and it's always the case
Yeah, but
after a negotiation.
but as you said, I mean that's true. But as you said, that's always the case.
Yes,
You're not
yes,
gonna,
I'm
you're
not
not going
picking
to
on
walk in
Mamdani
and
about
say,
that.
"Here's a new budget, and I know that the unions are likely to ask for a 4% increase, so I'm putting it in right now." That's not the way labor negotiations
It will
work.
be interesting to see. I mean, he's incredibly pro-labor. How do you then negotiate to be responsible and you know, get the kind of productivity increases that would be necessary to make all these reforms and the improvements in how well the cities run.
I want to make one other point before you go there, just to say that something else that I hope will be true from any of us who are lobbying them, but from this administration. Some of the problems that we're talking about, not that they've been solved, but they've been better addressed in other American cities. And we perpetually act as if New York is so unusual that you can't possibly look at anything that's happening anyplace, and
Very
that's
good
just
point.
nonsense.
Yes, ma'am. Tell us your name and your campus.
My name is Maria Thomas. I'm from the Graduate School of Public Health, and I have a question on housing. It's a question and a comment. There is a certain population nobody's really thinking about, and it's the single-parent household. I live in NYCHA, and I had the education and the experience to solve some issues, but at the same time, it's like a trap you have. You have to pay 30% of your salary, so you are forced to make so much if you want to keep your benefits. If you make more, you lose everything. Not to mention the congestion pricing. So my question is, I know if there was a better, like administration within the company and more taking into consideration the tenants and their education, their experience, I think it could work, but it doesn't happen. It's a big gap between tenants and the board.
You know, it's, you know, the general question of affordability. Affordability is such a multi-factor issue. I mean, you know, it's squeezing the balloon. You squeeze it here and it pops out over here. You know, you're talking about the cost of childcare, the cost of, you know, a lot of benefits which are based on an income level, and you're discouraged from making more because that'll knock you out of your out of your benefits.
I'll say a few things to that really astute question, and one is like, you're discouraged from making more. That I think has become a popular narrative to think about the income caps for, not the income caps, but the rates of rent set in public housing and other places. I also want us to consider that part of the disincentive that happens there is actually because we don't have truly affordable options on the private market. So you are disincentivized from leaving public housing because, in fact, public housing is the only truly deeply affordable housing that exists.
And public housing was designed as flow-through housing. You move into it, you do better, and then you move on. And people are not moving on.
I think to a degree. I think it's a little bit up for debate exactly the design in terms of this was designed to be a temporary flow-through. I think that a lot of folks have made space, time, and community in NYCHA for generations.
Yes.
And I don't think that has actually been part and core of the problem. And to the question that we heard, I think that there also is tremendous value, talent, and ability in NYCHA, and also a huge representation of our workforce, including our city workforce. And I think one way to thread some of the needle and what different questions that we've come up with or have considered today is thinking about the value of public housing residents. And I think that there's been a movement amongst housing residents and organizers to move towards resident management corporations that would, for example, turn property management over to residents. And there are mechanisms through Section 9 in public housing and the Federal Housing Department to fund and train and support workforce development that would empower residents to have an ownership stake and also be more specifically involved in their property management. And this could work as not only a public works to include job employment and job training, but then residents are in the driver's seat around repairs and how their buildings and their developments are being managed, right? So I think there are a lot of creative ways to use public investment to also address the deep backlog of repairs and also deal with the broader issues in the labor market right now too.
There is a political aspect to this, electoral, very well connected to housing. Elected officials, council members, assembly, senators, congressmen, they know where the vote is coming from. And usually are this public housing. They know who lives there. They know how many people are in the whole complex. And they do the analysis of what we call EDs, electoral districts. One project, and Ruth, you know this, one project can have 3 electoral districts or 2 electoral districts, which are composed of 1,500 people each electoral district. So if you want to win an election at the local level for city council, you depend on that housing project and other housing projects in your district politically. So my point is that besides the economics that we have been discussing here, there is all these political aspects that usually goes under the radar that we don't detect that may inhibit an elected official from moving forward with basically something that may replace those tenants that are there.
You know, let me, you know, I don't want to ignore politics. I'm a total political junkie, but this is an election year. This is a legislative election year. Yeah. This is a congressional election year. And Mamdani, as the most prominent elected Democratic Socialist of America candidate in the nation, I mean, you know, before him, they could only win in very small council or legislative districts. This is unheard of, what he's done, which has put him under tremendous pressure to support an expansion of DSA power. And in some cases, he said okay, and in some cases, He said no. I mean, he's refused to support Chiose, the council member who wanted to run against Hakeem Jeffries, who's positioned to be the speaker if the Democrats take the House. He has backed Espaillat against the Diaz in the congressional Harlem up into the
Washington
Bronx
Heights.
congressional district. He has opposed Dan Goldman who's running for re-election, by supporting Brad Lander. And when Nydia Velázquez is stepping down, and she's supporting the Brooklyn Borough President, Antonio Reynoso, she's backing Claire Valdez, a DSA. I mean, he is backing Claire Valdez, a DSA legislator. So he's kind of hedging his bets politically. I mean, you talk about politics. All politics is local.
Exactly. So that's the issue. It's not only the economic, it's not only capitalism, it's not only socialism, it's how politics maneuver in that sea and with all those different obstacles. Because at the end of the day, if you don't have the support of the congressperson or if there is a bill on housing at the city council or at the state level, then it's going to be a problem.
I mean, have you ever been involved in politics?
Oh, me?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, how is he?
But it's very, very funny, the issue that when Jaime raised this, first of all, because with great respect, because she's an amazing political official in New York City. Gail Brewer, when she first ran, she was my staff person for many years when I was in the city council, when we only had literally 1 or 2 staff people. And
She's a civic saint. I mean, there's just two ways about it.
She's what?
A civic saint.
Yes, but early, when she was beginning to think about the idea that she might run for office instead of just work in government, a person whose name I certainly will not mention on television came to me and said, like, you're stepping up from city council to borough president. I'd like you to, I've worked in all your campaigns, I'm getting into politics, I'd like you to consider me for city council, for your seat. And I said, usually often you hedge your bets, let me see, whatever. I said no. And he said, why no? And I said, because even though she takes forever to make up her mind, still true, I believe that Gail Brewer will run. And he basically said, so. And I said, Gail Brewer's worked for me. Every single human being in every NYCHA project in our district knows her name and has her phone number.
Exactly.
Yes, ma'am. Tell us your name.
Good afternoon. My name is Mary Mojisalalo Agungbemi. I'm a student of BMCC, Borough of Manhattan Community College. And my question goes to you, ma'am, Ruth Messenger. So you mentioned housing for ordinary people, but many of us still face rent, security deposits, and broker fees just to get an apartment. For students, especially international students, decent housing can feel still very out of reach. So what practical solutions are there, and who exactly is included when we say ordinary people?
Isn't that a good question?
That's a great question, but what I was saying was there's categories and categories of people really who make up the population of New York City that don't have the income to get an ordinary house on the ordinary market, but that we want to keep in the city. So yes, students, single parents, but we could list here many seniors. The question is, how does the city start planning to keep those people in the city? And I think frankly, for all the time that I've been in government, and since I've been in government, which is a long time, there are people in New York who sort of see, I'm not saying that they have all the answers, but they see the need to try to keep everybody and try to figure out programs for these wildly different populations, and people who don't, people who just assume, like, if they're not here, that's fine. And from all I can say, I don't have all the answers, and actually James is a much better housing expert than I am, but the point is, if we want the city to build on what I see as its strength, then we need to think about programs that work for many different populations. So right now, most of my work in the last 5 years has been with the newest New Yorkers. There are 500,000 people who've come into New York since August of 2022 for a variety of reasons. If you look at the history of New York over 100 years, it's been immigrants who contributed to...
But in the age of Trump, immigration is so significantly down as a source of new population.
But then that becomes something that, what I'm saying is something that we're going to lose.
Absolutely.
And so the question is, who are these immigrants? How do we move them on a track for Look, here's a very simple question. Last administration, the Adams administration was forced by law to provide shelters and hotels for new immigrants. They were under the control of the city. We could not get the mayor to put English as a second language classes in those hotels and shelters. You mean you would have had like literally 100,000 people who were potentially income generators for their families who could move up the employment route much, much faster because we were helping them to learn English. We could have paid for it. It would have paid itself back immediately. But there's not that kind of thinking. So I appreciate the question, which is a complicated one, but these are all populations that we want to keep. We need some programs that meet people's needs.
Yes, sir.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Marcus Kahn, and I'm from City College. So my question kind of pertains to the tax situation that's going on between the city and the state. So essentially, Mamdani presented a new issue and problem to us through the budget gap, which not many people had known about prior to him kind of mentioning it and making it a issue. And so his solution to combat the resistance of raising taxes on the rich involved using those who are trying to build wealth through home ownership as collateral. And you kind of mentioned it earlier, if it was like kind of like a threat. And so my question is, how do you all feel about his actions using New Yorkers as collateral in this way to get what he wants from the state, even if it's for the benefit of New York?
Very good question, because the property tax hikes that the mayor has suggested are one of the few levers that he can control himself without approval by without needing approval by the state. And at the same time, I think you made the point, there's this huge swath of homeowning communities of color in Southeast Queens and parts of the Bronx where that's their equity. That's their path to the American dream.
I wanted also to talking about the homeowners and 1 and 2 family or 3 family properties. That is a lot of where immigrants get absorbed. That is a lot of where you find these newcomers finding a room here, sharing, and these 500,000 people do get absorbed, and it's not public housing because they cannot get public housing. So I think it's very important to have this flexible housing that contributes to the city. And,
we're in agreement. I'm just saying if there were easier access to programs for them, they would move, they would become they would become more comfortable renters, and they would start to build equity and get their own housing in odd little places in the city.
But the question he asked was, because he is stymied because the mayor is stymied in his attempt to get the governor to raise the top levels of income tax that the city can charge, he's kind of dangled this kind of punishing, if you will,
he may come to regret that. He may come to regret saying that.
But no, but I mean, but that's the. But again, that's the balloon. You squeeze it here, it pops out.
Right. Yeah. But as Jaime pointed out before, there's not endless money, but there's a lot of state money and a lot of federal money, some of which is meant to be addressing some of the issues and problems and challenges that we have here. We have a president who chooses to scapegoat immigrants at every turn and not engage at all. But given Mamdani's fairly clever ways of negotiating with this president, he could go and make the case that X, Y, and Z, okay? I mean, I can give you, I believe in examples, so I'll give you one example. We have a shortage in the state of New York of certified nurse assistants. Those are the people who are going to take care of me shortly. The state of New York Department of Labor says we need, in the next 4 years, 40,000 certified nurse assistants. Wow. 40,000, that's a state labor analysis. There are programs, I know them, I could name them, that are ready to train as many new New Yorkers as we could pay for. And at the end of 3 months, they have a city university, community college, certified nurse assistant degree, and they can get a union wage job. So why is not only why are we not going at every level of government to do this, but to say to Liana, why doesn't somebody say to the private sector, I'm doing it, but I'm like nobody, but talking to donors like foundations, businesses, like what if you put $1 million into this program? Here's the payoff So anyway, I'm just saying that there are lots of options. I'd like to see the Mamdani administration engaging with more of them, but I think they will. Again, I'm going to go back to where I started, and then I'll shut up. 100 days is a very small piece of time.
Yes. Ma'am, one last question. Let's get it in.
Okay. Hi, my name is Mary Mojisalalo Agungbimi, and I'm from Borough of Manhattan Community College. So my question again is for you, ma'am. So you mentioned something about like an app for finding houses and
services.
yeah.
Shelter, for overnight shelter.
Yeah. And, you know, a couple of times I've seen situations where police officers send homeless people away. And on one of these many occasions, the homeless man was like, "Where do you want me to go?" And the man said, "I don't know, I don't care. And you just can't stay here." And I was really bothered, really. And I asked at the office where I was interning, at that time, the assembly office, and I found out about like there are actually houses, but I didn't even really know that there was an app or anything of such.
There isn't. I'm saying someone said there should be an app.
Oh, there should be.
But if any city agency could create, and not me, but any city agency could create this app tomorrow and test it and just say, here are the people, not maybe every human being should have access to it, or maybe only trained social workers, or maybe only police officers. I don't know. That's
This
the
is
kind
also
of thing
fits
we
in-
need government to do, is figure out how might we do this better than we're doing it now.
Well, you would also think because of the mayor's focus on what is the Office of Community
Community safety, yeah.
the Department of Community Safety, to kind of shift a lot of the dealing with the homeless situations on the streets, taking it away from the police department and putting it into the hands of trained social workers, that it would appeal to them. I mean, there's, it's, otherwise you're just moving it along. You're just, sending it to the next block.
Yeah, but and then it becomes a circle.
Yeah.
And it keeps going and it keeps going and
Yeah.
it keeps going. At one point, you have to put a stop on that, and it's basically to provide the services that they really need immediately. So social workers are basically employees. My concern is about the agencies and at the city hall level, at the state level, that are going to provide the resources necessary in order for the social workers to do what they have to do. But not only social workers, they are public health workers, hospitals, etc. Undocumented people and documented people who are immigrants, they live in a society, in a city that is called New York, and they cannot be ostracized.
And we
all
rely
the
on them. And we rely on them in our day-to-day lives.
Exactly. So they cannot be ostracized from all the benefits that this city can provide. Not only that, they're going to have children. And like I said before, I focus a lot on the political aspect, electoral aspect, because those are the ones that the elected officials legislate. These are potential voters. And one day they're going to be voting. Their children are going to be voting. They may have children who were around 18. I don't know the statistics on that. How many children of the last generation of immigrants are around? They have children around 18 or more.
Who were born here, who are not undocumented, right?
Who were not undocumented.
Although you do have
60% of New York is immigrants or children of immigrants. 60%.
60%. You know how, politically talking, electorally talking, because that's what I do, that's a population that I really want to go after. Whether you're a Republican, whether you're a Democrat, whether you're a fascist, whether you're a socialist, that's the population that you want to go, because that's the future. Not only that, at this point, even today, it can be the vote that can decide an election, even if it's not the majority of the vote. They can decide an election if you register them, if you provide them, with the legalities that they need.
Well, that's one of the things that the Latino Leadership Institute
That's what we do, yes.
did at Hunter, where you used to drag me in to speak.
No, you're coming in June.
We only have a couple of minutes left. We are, as Ruth says, we're just 3 months in, and we're not even to 100 days yet as we're taping this. What are you looking for, briefly? What are you looking for that would be a signpost? Are you looking at the rent guidelines board? I mean, what are you looking at?
I think I'm looking at how well he's going to deliver on the complicated things, the rollout and the savings, being pragmatic in the actual management of the city. He's been incredibly good at marketing, and that is half the job. I mean, it's really, he's great at communicating. His move to enable
His
TikTok
part of that is to try to limit things that the city is committed to. Some of the social service advancements, he's saying, no, we can't afford to do those now.
So he's managing the narrative really, really well. But ultimately, it comes down to what he actually does with the city's money and with the city's workforce.
And as a political matter, he has to manage expectations as well.
But
as,
I think we're saying the same thing. I think he does get this. It's just, it's a lot of going to your public,
Yeah.
and again, it's a little different from being a small town mayor, right? If you're upstate and you have a population of 19,000 people and you're on the streets, you can keep saying, oh, we thought we were going to do the river, clean the river this year, but actually we're going to do it next year. He needs to figure out what that looks like in New York City, to constantly keep saying to people, a promise that I made, I can only keep, as I said, on the parks budget over 4 years. Here's how you can check me, or whatever.
I have literally 25 seconds left. What are you looking for in this?
I'm looking for where and how the city's putting its money, specifically into housing and public housing, and how we're thinking about investing in deeply affordable housing, not just creating units to fit some kind of unit counter, and thinking about housing policy that comes from the bottom up rather than something that comes from the top.
Thank you all. We're running out of time. I always make deadline, and we'll see you next time on CUNY Forum. Thank you.